Hey guys, what sounds, from a modern distance, like simple dirtiness was usually something far more complicated. A world in which bathing could be costly, inconvenient, seasonally difficult, morally debated, and sometimes even physically risky in ways people today rarely stop to imagine. Before we settle in, let me know where you're watching from and what history topic you'd like me to cover next. And if you enjoy this kind of thoughtful long-form history, a quiet like is always a lovely way to support the channel. If you'd like more calm, deeply human stories from the past, subscribing is a simple way to stay with us. Now, with that said, to understand why medieval people rarely bathed in the way we expect, we have to begin by setting aside one of the easiest modern assumptions, that people in the Middle Ages were simply indifferent to cleanliness. In reality, most people were not indifferent at all. They lived with strong ideas about filth, odor, bodily comfort, purity, social appearance, and proper conduct. What differed was not whether cleanliness mattered, but what cleanliness meant, how it could realistically be achieved, and what forms of washing seemed sensible in a world of cold rooms, limited fuel, uncertain water quality, and hard physical labor. One reason the topic is so often flattened into caricature is that modern people tend to imagine bathing as a single, obvious routine. We think of a private bathroom, heated water on demand, soap within reach, towels drying quickly, and a culture that treats the full-body bath or shower as an ordinary part of weekly, if not daily, life. Medieval people did not live inside that system. Even the simplest act of washing the whole body required a chain of material conditions that could not be taken for granted. Water had to be carried, heated, and poured. A tub had to exist. A room had to be warm enough. Time had to be spared. Privacy had to be found. And afterward, the body and clothing had to be dried in a drafty environment that might remain cold for hours. For peasants, artisans, servants, and laborers, daily life was already governed by effort. Water was not a tap away. Fuel was not a background utility. The work of maintaining the household was constant and repetitive. Bread had to be baked, pottage stirred, tools maintained, animals fed, bedding aired, floors swept, clothes mended, and manure or waste managed. In such a world, the idea of heating a substantial quantity of water merely to immerse the whole body was not impossible, but it was rarely trivial. Cleanliness had to be balanced against labor, season, cost, and need. This is one of the first important corrections to the cliché. Medieval people did wash. They washed their hands. They washed their faces. They rinsed their mouths. They wiped down exposed skin. They combed their hair, cleaned under their nails, and changed linen when they could. These acts mattered because much of what passed for respectable bodily care was focused on the visible and socially immediate parts of the body. A person's hands, face, hairline, breath, and outer garments shaped how they were perceived. To appear entirely neglected was undesirable. The difference is that routine cleanliness was often partial, targeted, and practical rather than centered on frequent full-body immersion. Linen played an especially important role here. In a world before modern detergents and easy laundering, underclothing served as a kind of absorbent layer between the body and more expensive outer garments. A clean shift or chemise or a reasonably fresh shirt did some of the work that we today assign to constant bathing. It absorbed sweat and oils. It could be changed and washed more easily than wool or heavy outerwear. To modern ears, this may sound like a poor substitute, but within the material logic of the period it made sense. If one could wash cloth more readily than one could regularly heat enough water for a full bath, then bodily management shifted toward textile care as much as skin care. Even soap, where available, did not guarantee the sort of bathing rhythm we might imagine. Soap existed in various forms across medieval Europe, and recipes differed. But availability, quality, and cost varied widely. Soap was not necessarily an abundant household staple in every region and class at every moment. And beyond soap there remained the larger issue of infrastructure. The limiting factor was often less the idea of cleaning agents than the total effort required to create a warm, private, comfortable washing experience. Season mattered enormously. A warm bath in summer was one thing. A bath in deep winter, in a house with imperfect insulation and a floor that seemed to hold the cold like stone, was quite another. We often underestimate how much medieval life was shaped by thermal discomfort. Even among people who were used to cold, there is a difference between enduring chilly air while clothed and deliberately undressing, wetting the body, and then trying to become dry and warm again without central heating. In colder months, a full bath could feel not refreshing but imprudent. The danger did not need to be dramatic to be real. It was enough that one might feel weakened, chilled, or simply miserable afterward. And this leads to another overlooked point. Medieval understandings of health were not identical to ours, but they were not irrational. People often believed that the body was vulnerable in specific states. After heat, after exertion, after sex, after eating heavily, after bloodletting, or when the pores were thought to be open. Warm baths could be pleasant, but they could also be interpreted as weakening if taken under the wrong conditions. Some medical traditions treated bathing as potentially therapeutic, but also as something to be timed, moderated, and approached with care. In other words, bathing was not always considered an uncomplicated good. Could help, but it could also disturb the balance of the body. That sense of bodily vulnerability existed within broader medieval medical thinking shaped by the humoral tradition. People understood health through balance. Hot, cold, wet, dry. Different bodies were believed to have different constitutions. Different ages and seasons made different demands. So a bath was not merely a matter of getting clean. It might warm or soften the body, open pores, relax limbs, stir humors, or alter the body's internal condition in ways that seemed medically meaningful. From a modern point of view, some of this is mistaken. But from within its own system, it encouraged caution rather than routine repetition. Religious and moral language also entered the picture, though not always in the simple way later stereotypes suggest. Medieval Christianity did not ban cleanliness, nor did it celebrate filth for its own sake. Monastic rules, urban customs, and courtly habits all show concern for order, bodily discipline, and propriety. But there could be suspicion, in certain contexts, of excessive luxury, vanity, sensual indulgence, or idleness. Bathing became morally ambiguous not because washing itself was sinful, but because pleasure, nudity, and leisure could be. A practical wash was one thing. Lingering in sensual comfort, especially in mixed or socially charged settings, could be judged differently. This is where bathhouses enter the story, and with them an important complication. Medieval Europe was not a continent of people who had never conceived of bathing spaces. Public and semi-public baths existed in many towns and cities, especially in earlier and high medieval periods. In some regions, bathhouses were familiar parts of urban life. They could provide warm water and a setting for more substantial washing than many homes could manage. In some cases, they were associated with sociability, grooming, medical treatment, and even dining or conversation. Their existence alone should make us pause before repeating the old fantasy that medieval people simply never bathed. But bathhouses also reveal why the subject is more uneasy than it first appears. Public bathing brought together questions of privacy, morality, disease, class, and reputation. In some places, bathhouses developed associations with prostitution or sexual looseness. In others, they remained respectable under certain conditions and suspect under others. Their popularity could rise and fall according to local custom, civic regulation, and fear of illness. What begins, then, as an apparently simple solution to the problem of household bathing turns into another reminder that washing the body was embedded in the social world. not separate from it. For wealthier households, the possibilities were different, though not infinitely so. Nobles, high clergy, prosperous merchants, and courtly households had greater access to labor, heated rooms, better fabrics, and in some cases dedicated washing arrangements. Tubs could be brought in. Water could be heated by servants. Bathing might appear as a comfort associated with rank. Yet even here the bath was often an event rather than a frictionless daily habit. It required preparation. It involved attendants, vessels, screens, linens, and a managed interior space. In some courts it could be luxurious, but luxury is not the same as frequency. The very effort involved could make the experience more ceremonial than routine. The ordinary peasant cottage, by contrast, was not designed around private bodily leisure. It was designed around survival, cooking, sleeping, storage, work, and the management of smoke, heat, and animals. Depending on the region and period, families might live in close quarters, sometimes sharing space with livestock or at least living in immediate proximity to them. Floors could be earthen. Ventilation was imperfect. Fabrics absorbed odor. Fire produced soot. Labor produced sweat. And yet, within that environment, people still practiced forms of order. They aired bedding, swept rushes, shook out cloth, and maintained degrees of bodily and domestic cleanliness that mattered within their own standards. That phrase, within their own standards, matters. One of the easiest mistakes in popular history is to compare the medieval world directly to the most sanitized and technologically supported parts of modern life, then declare the past disgusting. But people judge comfort relative to what is normal around them. Medieval people were sensitive to stench, rot, corruption, and foul air. They recognized the difference between fresh and stale, between washed and neglected, between a respectable person and a slovenly one. Their threshold was not identical to ours, but neither was it absent. Human noses did not suddenly evolve in the 19th century. Indeed, smell itself carried social meaning. Strong odor could signal labor, poverty, illness, crowding, or lack of access to resources. Pleasant scents, by contrast, could suggest rank, care, and refinement. Herbs, flowers, pomanders, incense, and scented waters all belonged, in different ways, to efforts to shape personal and indoor atmosphere. This was not the same as modern deodorizing, but it shows again that medieval people cared very much how bodies and spaces felt and smelled. The issue was not apathy. The issue was constraint. Water sources imposed their own complications. Rivers, wells, cisterns, streams, and rainwater collection all had different advantages and dangers. Water might be fresh, stagnant, muddy, distant, frozen, or contested. In towns, population density could compromise cleanliness. In rural areas, the labor of carrying water remained central. Even when enough water could be obtained for cooking and basic washing, using much larger quantities for baths was another matter. Water was heavy. Every bucket represented effort. In some settings, the bath began not with ease, but with repeated journeys and aching arms. And then there was the problem of laundering after the bath. Medieval bathing was not only about the body. It was also about what happened next. One needed clean or at least dry linen, some degree of warmth, and a workable space for drying cloth and skin. The body could not be separated from its garments because clothing was not casually replaceable. Textiles were expensive relative to income. A poor household might own only a limited number of garments. Keeping them serviceable was essential. So bodily care often fitted into a broader rhythm of textile management, seasonal washing, and domestic labor rather than a private hygiene routine detached from the rest of life. There is also a quieter psychological truth here. Modern bathing is tied to privacy in a way that is not universally historical. Many medieval people lived with little privacy at all. Bodies were not unknown, but secluded comfort was scarce. To undress, wash, and redress was sometimes a social act, a household act, or an exposed act rather than a solitary retreat. That does not necessarily mean people were unembarrassed. It means their threshold for bodily visibility existed inside different domestic arrangements. Still, for many, the lack of privacy could make bathing less inviting, especially for women, adolescents, or anyone navigating status and vulnerability inside a crowded home. What they did instead, then, was not one single substitute. It was a collection of practices. Washing parts of the body more than the whole, changing and laundering linen, combing and grooming the hair, wiping the skin, using basins and cloths, visiting bathhouses when possible, and reserving full immersion for particular circumstances rather than treating it as a default routine. Cleanliness was assembled piecemeal, through habits adapted to climate, class, medical belief, and the shape of daily life. And even this is only the beginning, because once we move past the question of how often medieval people bathed, a more interesting question appears underneath it. Not simply how they washed, but what the body itself meant in a world where heat, smell, labor, religion, medicine, and social respectability were all entangled. The medieval bath was never just about water. It sat at the meeting point of comfort and caution, pleasure and suspicion, necessity and effort. And that is why the story becomes more revealing the closer we look, especially when we begin to see how different bathing could be for townspeople, nobles, monks, travelers, and the rural poor in a medieval town. The experience of cleanliness was shaped not only by the limits of the household, but by the rhythms of the street itself. Towns brought people closer together, physically, socially, economically, and that proximity created both opportunities and complications. Water might be more accessible through public wells, fountains, or nearby rivers, but it was also more contested. The same sources that supplied drinking water could be affected by waste, runoff, or simple overcrowding. Clean water, in other words, was not always reliably clean in the way modern viewers instinctively assume. Yet towns also made something else possible: shared solutions. The bathhouse, which we touched on earlier, begins to take on more texture here. In some regions, especially during the High Medieval period, bathhouses could be relatively common features of urban life. They were not identical everywhere, but many offered heated water, steam, and a space where the labor of preparing a bath was distributed rather than carried by a single household. For a fee, a person could enter a space already arranged for warmth and immersion. At first glance, this seems like a clear answer to the problem of infrequent bathing. But as with so many aspects of medieval life, the reality is layered. Bathhouses were social environments. People did not simply enter, wash, and leave in silence. They might eat, talk, relax, and spend time in a shared setting. In some places, men and women bathed separately. In others, there were mixed arrangements depending on local custom and regulation. The atmosphere could be relaxed, even convivial. And this is precisely where the tension begins to emerge. Because a place designed for warmth, relaxation, and bodily exposure also carried a certain moral ambiguity. It is not that bathhouses were universally disreputable, but they existed on a spectrum. Some were well regarded and regulated, while others developed reputations that blurred into the world of prostitution and casual intimacy. Civic authorities and religious voices sometimes tried to control or reshape these spaces, not necessarily because bathing was objectionable, but because the social behaviors surrounding it could become difficult to contain. This shifting reputation had consequences. In periods of anxiety, whether moral, social, or medical, bathhouses could become targets of suspicion. During times of disease, for example, The idea of gathering bodies together in enclosed, warm environments could feel less like a comfort and more like a risk. As waves of epidemic illness moved through Europe, especially from the 14th century onward, public spaces of all kinds came under scrutiny. Bathhouses were no exception. Their popularity in some areas declined, not because people suddenly abandoned the idea of washing, but because the context in which washing occurred had become uncertain. So even in towns, where infrastructure offered more possibilities, bathing remained a negotiated practice. It was shaped by cost, reputation, timing, and circumstance. A person might visit a bathhouse occasionally, but not regularly enough to form a routine that resembled modern habits. And between those visits, the same partial methods, washing hands and face, managing linen, maintaining appearance, continued to define everyday cleanliness. For travelers, the situation shifted again. Medieval travel was rarely comfortable. Roads could be rough or muddy, distances long, and accommodations unpredictable. Inns existed, but their quality varied widely. A traveler might arrive after days of exposure to dust, sweat, weather, and physical strain. The desire to wash would have been very real, but the means to do so depended entirely on where one stopped. Some inns could provide basins of water, perhaps warmed, along with cloths and a degree of privacy. But a full bath was far less certain. The traveler had to accept what was available. In this context, cleanliness became something opportunistic. One washed when one could, as much as one could, using whatever resources were present. It was less a routine than a series of small recoveries from the road. Monastic life offers another angle, one that is often misunderstood in the opposite direction. Monks and nuns lived under rules that governed daily behavior in careful detail. These rules sometimes included guidance on washing, but not necessarily in the way modern viewers might expect. Cleanliness was valued, but it was framed within discipline, moderation, and humility. Excessive attention to the body could be discouraged, not because the body was unimportant, but because it could become a source of distraction or vanity. In some monastic communities, regular washing of hands and face was expected, especially before meals or prayer. There might be provisions for bathing at certain times of the year, or under particular circumstances, such as illness. But again, full immersion was not typically a daily or even weekly routine. It was something measured, limited, and integrated into a broader pattern of regulated life. And yet, even here we see variation. Wealthier monasteries, particularly in later periods, sometimes had more elaborate facilities. Some included bathhouses within their own complexes, allowing monks to bathe under controlled conditions. These spaces could be carefully managed to align with the community's values, avoiding the social ambiguities of public bathhouses while still acknowledging the practical need for bodily care. This balance between necessity and restraint appears again and again across different medieval settings. Among the nobility, the bath could become something more deliberate, even staged. There are accounts of baths prepared with attention to comfort, tubs lined or cushioned, water scented with herbs, servants attending to the process. In such cases, bathing was not only about cleanliness but about experience. It could signal status, leisure, and refinement. But here, too, there is a quiet contradiction. Because even when bathing was luxurious, it was not necessarily frequent. The very effort involved in preparing such an experience meant that it remained occasional. It was something arranged, anticipated, and completed with care, rather than something woven effortlessly into daily life. In a sense, the more elaborate the bath became, the more it revealed its own rarity. Across all these settings, one detail continues to surface: the importance of incremental cleanliness. Medieval people did not rely on a single act to maintain their bodies. They relied on a sequence of smaller actions, repeated and adapted to circumstance. washing the face upon waking, rinsing the hands before eating, combing and covering the hair, changing linen when possible. These acts did not replace the bath, but they reduced its necessity. This is perhaps one of the most subtle shifts in perspective. Modern viewers often imagine bathing as the foundation of cleanliness, with everything else as a supplement. In the medieval world, it was often the reverse. Daily or near-daily habits formed the foundation, while the full bath was an occasional addition. When seen this way, the apparent absence of frequent bathing becomes less surprising. It was not a missing piece, but a different arrangement of priorities. Even the language of cleanliness reflected this. Words associated with purity, order, and propriety often carried moral as well as physical meanings. To be clean could refer not only to the body, but to behavior, intention, or social standing. This layering of meaning meant that bodily practices were never entirely separate from the way a person was judged within their community. And that judgment could be subtle. A person who appeared disordered, unkempt, or inattentive to basic grooming might not be seen simply as dirty, but as lacking discipline or respect. Conversely, someone who maintained a composed appearance, even without frequent full bathing, could be understood as respectable. Cleanliness, in other words, was communicated through signs that went beyond the skin. All of this begins to shift how we think about discomfort as well. It is easy to imagine medieval life as constantly unpleasant, defined by an unrelieved sense of dirt and odor. But people adapt to their environments. They become accustomed to the textures, scents, and routines that surround them. What feels unbearable to one era can feel ordinary to another. This does not mean medieval life was comfortable by modern standards. It means that comfort itself is not a fixed category. And in some cases, the absence of frequent bathing may have been less central to daily discomfort than we assume. Other aspects of life, cold, hunger, labor, illness, insecurity, could dominate attention far more. Washing the entire body, while desirable under certain conditions, was not always the most urgent concern. Still, there were moments when the difference became more noticeable. Festivals, gatherings, or encounters with higher status individuals could sharpen awareness of appearance. In these contexts, people might make greater efforts to present themselves well, drawing on whatever means were available. A partial wash, cleaner garments, a combed beard, or arranged hair. These could be enough to mark the occasion, even without a full bath. And occasionally, the bath itself could become part of a larger transition. Before marriage, after illness, upon entering or leaving a particular state of life, there were moments when washing the body took on a symbolic weight, not just a practical one. These moments hint at something deeper, that bathing, even when infrequent, was not trivial. It could carry meaning beyond hygiene, touching on ideas of renewal, preparation, or change. But to fully understand that symbolic dimension, we have to look more closely at how medieval people thought about the body itself. Not just as something to be cleaned, but as something that could be opened, closed, strengthened, weakened, protected, or exposed depending on how it was treated. And it is in that understanding, especially in relation to water, heat, and the unseen forces people believed moved through the air and the body, that the logic of medieval bathing begins to take a more unexpected and revealing turn. Because to a medieval mind, the body was not sealed in the way we often imagine it today. It was instead porous, open to influence, responsive to environment, and constantly interacting with what surrounded it. Skin was not simply a boundary. It was a surface through which heat, moisture, and invisible qualities could pass. And this belief shaped how people thought about exposure, especially in moments when the body was warmed, softened, or, as they might have described it, opened. A warm bath in this framework did more than clean the surface. It loosened the skin, relaxed the flesh, and opened the pores. This could be beneficial. It could ease stiffness, encourage circulation, and provide a sense of relief after labor or illness. But it also created a moment of vulnerability. If the body was open, then it was also more susceptible to whatever the surrounding air might carry. This is where the concept of bad air, or miasma, becomes important, not in the exaggerated way it is sometimes presented, but as a genuine attempt to explain how illness spread. Medieval people did not understand germs, but they observed patterns. They noticed that sickness often followed foul smells, decaying matter, stagnant water, or crowded environments. From these observations, they developed the idea that corrupted air could enter the body and disturb its balance. And if that air could enter the body, then the state of the body at the moment of exposure mattered. A person stepping out of a warm bath, with skin softened and pores open, might be seen as particularly at risk. Not because the bath itself was dirty, but because the act of bathing had temporarily changed the body's defenses. To move from heat into cold, or from enclosed warmth into uncertain air, was not simply uncomfortable. It could be interpreted as dangerous. This belief did not mean that bathing was avoided entirely, but it did encourage caution. It mattered when one bathed, where one bathed, and what happened immediately afterward. A bath taken in a controlled, warm environment, followed by careful drying and rest, might be considered beneficial. The same bath, followed by exposure to cold drafts or foul air, might be seen as harmful. The difference was not the water itself, but the transition that followed. And this is where the story becomes quietly more intricate, because in a world without central heating, stable indoor climates, or controlled ventilation, managing that transition was not easy. Even a well-prepared bath could end with a person stepping back into a room that gradually cooled, into clothing that might not be fully dry, or into air that shifted unpredictably with the weather. So bathing required not just resources but timing. It required awareness of the environment, of the body's condition, and of the surrounding air. It was not something to be done casually, without thought. And over time, this cautious relationship with bathing became part of broader cultural habits. People learned, through experience and shared belief, that washing the body was not a neutral act. It was something to be approached with a degree of judgment. This helps explain a pattern that can otherwise seem contradictory. In earlier medieval periods, especially in regions influenced by Roman traditions, bathing, both public and private, appears more common. But over time, particularly in parts of late medieval and early modern Europe, attitudes begin to shift. Bathing becomes less frequent in some areas, more restricted, more conditional. This is not a simple decline into neglect. It is, at least in part, a response to changing ideas about health, environment, and risk. The outbreaks of epidemic disease reinforce this shift. When illness spreads in ways that are not fully understood, people look for patterns, and they often find them in places where bodies gather, where air feels heavy, or where the boundaries between people seem less controlled. Bathhouses, with their warmth, moisture, and proximity, could begin to feel suspect. Not universally and not all at once, but enough to alter behavior over time. At the same time, clothing itself begins to take on an even greater role in managing the body's relationship with the environment. Layers of fabric, especially linen close to the skin, are understood not only as garments, but as protective interfaces. They absorb moisture, regulate contact with the air, and create a buffer between the body and external influences. Changing these layers becomes a way of maintaining balance without exposing the body too directly. In this context, the act of removing clothing, immersing the body, and then redressing becomes more than a question of effort. It becomes a moment in which the body moves from protected to exposed and back again. Each stage carries its own considerations, and if the environment cannot be fully controlled, then minimizing those transitions begins to make practical sense. There is also a quieter, almost psychological dimension to this. When a practice carries even a small degree of perceived risk, people tend to perform it less frequently, even if the risk is not clearly defined. The memory of illness, the stories of others, the advice of physicians, the warnings of elders, all of these accumulate. Over time, they shape habits not through strict rules, but through a gradual shift in what feels sensible. So the medieval relationship with bathing becomes one of selective engagement. People do not abandon it. They adapt it. They place it within boundaries. They reserve it for moments when the conditions feel right, when the weather is suitable, when the body needs it, when the environment can be managed. And outside of those moments, they rely on other forms of care that feel safer, more stable, and more consistent with daily life. This is why the idea that medieval people rarely bathed begins to reveal its limitations. It is true in a narrow sense, if we measure bathing by modern standards of frequency and immersion. But it obscures the reasoning behind that pattern. It suggests absence where there was, in fact, a different kind of presence, a continuous attention to the body expressed through other means. And those other means were often quite deliberate. Herbal infusions could be used in water when bathing did occur, not only for scent, but for perceived health benefits. Cloths could be warmed and applied to the body. Steam, in certain contexts, could be used therapeutically. These practices did not always resemble modern hygiene routines, but they reflect an ongoing engagement with bodily care. Even the simple act of washing hands before meals carried layers of meaning. It was practical, removing visible dirt. It was social, signaling respect for others at the table. And it was, in some contexts, symbolic, marking a transition into a shared, ordered space. These small acts, repeated daily, did much of the work that we might otherwise attribute to less frequent, larger acts like bathing. And yet, despite all of this adaptation, there remains a sense, subtle but persistent, that something is being balanced, that the medieval person is constantly navigating between opposing needs, the desire for comfort and cleanliness, and the need for safety and stability. The body must be cared for, but not exposed too freely. It must be refreshed, but not weakened. It must be maintained, but within the limits imposed by environment, belief, and available resources. It is within that balancing act that we begin to see a more human picture emerge. Not a world of neglect, but a world of careful adjustment. Not a rejection of cleanliness, but a different strategy for achieving it. And as we move further into the later medieval period, that balance becomes even more delicate, shaped not only by inherited ideas and daily realities, but by a growing sense that the unseen forces surrounding the body, whether carried in air, water, or contact, might be far more unpredictable than anyone had previously imagined. What begins to change, slowly and unevenly, is not just behavior, but confidence. Earlier habits, whether in bathing, gathering, or daily movement, had rested on a kind of lived familiarity with the world. People understood risk in terms they could observe. But when disease arrived in waves that seemed to ignore ordinary boundaries, that familiarity began to erode. Patterns no longer held as firmly. Practices that once felt safe became uncertain. And in that uncertainty, the body itself came to be viewed with a more guarded awareness. Not only as something that could be influenced by the environment, but as something that might also transmit influence outward. This was not a fully formed theory of contagion in the modern sense, but it was a shift toward seeing proximity between bodies, between breath, between shared spaces, as potentially significant in new ways. Bathing, especially in shared environments, sat directly within that concern. The bathhouse, once a place of warmth and relative comfort, could now be interpreted through a different lens. It gathered bodies, created heat and moisture. It blurred the boundaries between individuals not only physically, but atmospherically. The same qualities that once made it appealing, steam, closeness, relaxation, could now be reinterpreted as liabilities. This did not happen all at once, and it did not happen everywhere in the same way. But across parts of Europe, especially in the later medieval and early modern periods, there is evidence of bathhouses declining, closing, or changing in character. Sometimes this was due to direct regulation. Sometimes it was the result of shifting public sentiment. And sometimes it was simply the gradual withdrawal of people who no longer felt entirely comfortable in those spaces. At the same time, domestic habits adjusted in parallel. If public bathing became less appealing or less trusted, then the reliance on private, smaller-scale forms of washing grew more important. But as we've already seen, the home environment had its own limits. So the result was not a sudden increase in frequent full-body bathing, but rather a deeper reliance on controlled, partial methods. This is where we begin to see a kind of quiet reorganization of cleanliness. The emphasis shifts further toward managing the body through layers, surfaces, and routines that do not require full immersion. Linen becomes even more central. Clean cloth against the skin is not just a matter of comfort. It is a form of regulation. It absorbs, protects, and, in a sense, filters the interaction between body and world. Clothing itself starts to function almost like a second skin, one that can be removed, aired, and replaced without exposing the body too directly. And because this layer is easier to maintain than the body itself, at least in terms of washing and drying, it becomes a practical solution to an otherwise complex problem. There is also a subtle aesthetic shift that follows. Pale, dry skin begins to carry its own associations, not necessarily because it is cleaner in a modern hygienic sense, but because it suggests restraint, composure, and distance from excessive exposure. In some contexts, the freshly washed, but not overly bathed body becomes the ideal, not damp, not softened, not recently open to the environment, but stable. Even perfumes and scented substances take on a slightly different role. They are no longer just enhancements, but in some cases, protective elements. Strong scents were sometimes believed to counteract foul or dangerous air. Herbs, resins, and aromatic compounds could be carried, worn, or placed in rooms as a kind of invisible barrier. The body, once again, is not isolated, it is in constant negotiation with what surrounds it. And yet, despite all these adaptations, there are moments where the older relationship with bathing reasserts itself, especially under conditions where control can be restored. In royal courts, in certain medical contexts, or in carefully managed private spaces, bathing continues not as a daily habit, but as a deliberate act. Medical bathing, in particular, reveals another layer of this story. Physicians sometimes prescribe baths for specific conditions, joint pain, fatigue, skin issues, or imbalances of the humors. But these prescriptions were often highly specific. The temperature of the water mattered. The duration mattered. The timing mattered. What one ate before and after could matter. Even the emotional state of the bather might be considered relevant. In other words, bathing becomes almost technical. It is no longer a general act of cleanliness, but a targeted intervention, one that must be calibrated carefully. This further distances it from the idea of routine immersion. It becomes something one does for a reason under guidance, rather than as a simple habit. And this technical approach reinforces the broader caution. If bathing has the power to influence the body in significant ways, then it must be handled with care. It is not neutral. It is not always beneficial. It is something that requires knowledge, timing, and judgment. At the same time, the social meanings of cleanliness continue to evolve. As urban life becomes more structured, as clothing styles shift, and as distinctions between classes become more visually pronounced, the external signs of order gain importance. A well-kept appearance, clean hands, arranged hair, appropriate clothing, can communicate stability and respectability even in the absence of frequent bathing. This creates an interesting dynamic. The body itself becomes slightly less visible as a site of judgment, while its presentation becomes more significant. What others can see, what can be maintained without full immersion, takes precedence. And because this visible layer can be managed more easily and more frequently, it becomes the primary focus of daily care. There is also an economic dimension to this. As textile production, trade, and availability change over time, the capacity to maintain multiple sets of clothing improves, at least for certain segments of the population. This does not eliminate the challenges of laundering, but it does offer more flexibility. Clean linen becomes not only a sign of wealth, but a practical tool for managing bodily comfort. And beneath all of this, there remains the constant presence of labor. Most people's days were physically demanding. Fields had to be worked, goods transported, materials processed, homes maintained. The body was in motion, in contact with earth, tools, animals, and weather. In such a context, cleanliness could never be a static state. It was something that had to be continually negotiated, which is why the idea of a single, definitive solution, such as daily bathing, does not fully fit the structure of medieval life. Instead, there is a mosaic of practices, each addressing a different aspect of the problem, each shaped by its own constraints and logic. And perhaps the most revealing part of this is how little of it is accidental. These are not random habits. They are responses, sometimes cautious, sometimes adaptive, sometimes imperfect, but rarely thoughtless. They reflect a sustained effort to live within a world where comfort, safety, and understanding are all limited, but still deeply valued. As the late medieval period continues to unfold, and as ideas about the body, health, and environment continue to shift, sometimes gradually, sometimes abruptly, this delicate system of care begins to encounter new pressures, new interpretations, and new forms of uncertainty that will push it even further away from anything resembling a simple or consistent routine point. One of the more subtle pressures comes from something that, at first glance, has nothing to do with bathing at all: the growing complexity of clothing itself. As the later medieval period unfolds, garments in many parts of Europe become more fitted, more layered, and more structured. Tailoring improves. Styles evolve. Clothing begins to follow the contours of the body more closely, rather than hanging loosely in earlier, simpler forms. This has consequences that are easy to overlook. More fitted clothing traps heat differently. It holds moisture in different ways. It makes the relationship between skin and fabric more immediate, more continuous. And as this happens, the importance of managing that inner layer, the linen closest to the body, becomes even more pronounced. If outer garments are costly, shaped, and less frequently cleaned, then the inner layer must absorb more of the daily wear. So the routine of changing linen, when possible, becomes not just a matter of freshness, but of maintaining the entire system of dress. A clean shirt or shift is no longer simply a preference. It is part of how a person preserves the integrity of everything worn above it. This shift quietly reinforces the broader pattern we've been tracing. Cleanliness continues to move away from the act of immersing the body and toward the careful maintenance of what surrounds it. At the same time, domestic interiors begin to change in small but meaningful ways. In some households, particularly among the wealthier, there is a gradual increase in attention to private space. Rooms become more specialized. Screens, curtains, and partitions appear more frequently. Beds are enclosed. Chests store personal items. And within this growing sense of interiority, the possibility of more private forms of washing begins to expand, at least for those who can afford it. But even here, the expansion is limited. Privacy does not automatically produce abundance. A private room may allow a person to wash more comfortably, but it does not remove the need for water, fuel, or time. So while the setting becomes more controlled, the fundamental constraints remain. The bath is still an event, still something arranged, still something that must be justified against other demands. What does begin to shift, however, is the meaning of that private act. Bathing, when it occurs in a controlled interior space, takes on a quieter, more contained character. It is less social, less exposed, less ambiguous. It becomes something that can be managed within the household, rather than negotiated in public. And this, in turn, aligns more comfortably with the growing caution around shared environments. There is also a noticeable change in how water itself is perceived. In earlier periods, especially where Roman influence lingered, water could be associated with public life, with infrastructure, with the continuity of baths as civic spaces. But as those systems fade or fragment, water becomes more localized, more dependent on immediate sources, more variable in quality. This variability matters. When water is not consistently reliable, when it may be drawn from a well of uncertain cleanliness, or from a stream that changes with the season, the act of immersing the body becomes less straightforward. It is no longer simply about access, but about trust. And trust, once disrupted, does not easily return. So even as people continue to use water for washing, they do so with an awareness that it is not uniformly safe or beneficial. Boiling water for cooking is one thing. Submerging the body in it is another. The difference is not always clear, but it is felt. And this feeling, this sense of cautious engagement, extends into everyday habits in ways that are almost invisible to us now. A person might prefer to wipe the body with a cloth rather than immerse it fully. They might warm water gently rather than heating large quantities. They might focus on areas of the body that are most exposed or most likely to carry visible dirt. These choices are not dramatic, but they accumulate. They create a pattern in which cleanliness is maintained through consistency rather than intensity. There is also the question of time, which becomes increasingly structured as medieval society develops. Work rhythms, market days, religious observances, seasonal cycles. All of these shape how time is experienced. And within that structure, the allocation of time to different tasks becomes more deliberate. A full bath, requiring preparation, heating, and recovery, competes with other uses of time. It must be fitted into a schedule that is already full. And unless there is a compelling reason, illness, ceremony, or particular need, it can be postponed. Not indefinitely, but often enough that it never becomes habitual. This is especially true for those whose labor leaves little margin. A peasant working long hours in the field, or a craftsperson managing production deadlines, cannot easily afford to dedicate a large portion of the day to bathing. Even if the desire is there, the opportunity may not be. And yet, despite all these limitations, there are moments where the importance of washing the body reasserts itself with surprising clarity. One such moment is illness. When the body is unwell, the usual rules can shift. Bathing may be recommended or avoided depending on the condition, but in either case, the body becomes the focus of more careful attention. Warm water might be used to ease discomfort. Cloths might be applied to specific areas. The goal is no longer general cleanliness, but targeted care. Another moment is transition, those points in life where the body is understood to be moving from one state to another. Before certain ceremonies, after particular experiences, or at the threshold of new roles, washing can take on a more symbolic weight. It marks change, prepares the body. It signals a kind of internal adjustment, even if the underlying beliefs about health and risk remain. And then there are the moments of simple relief, rare, perhaps, but meaningful. A warm bath after prolonged labor, the sensation of heat against tired muscles, the temporary easing of tension. These experiences remind us that, even within a system shaped by caution and constraint, the desire for comfort does not disappear. It is simply negotiated. What becomes increasingly clear as we follow these patterns is that medieval bathing cannot be understood as a single practice or even a single attitude. It is a collection of decisions, each made within a specific context, each influenced by a combination of belief, environment, and necessity. And as those influences continue to evolve through changing climates, shifting populations, new medical ideas, and the gradual transformation of daily life, the balance that medieval people maintained between cleanliness and caution becomes even more complex, even more responsive, and, in some ways, even more distant from the assumptions we bring to it today. Because by the time we approach the threshold of the early modern world, the question is no longer simply how often people bathed, but how they understood the very act of washing itself, what it did to the body, what it exposed, what it protected against, and what risks it might quietly carry into a world that was becoming, in ways both visible and invisible, increasingly uncertain. And it is at this threshold that something even more subtle begins to take shape, a quiet redefinition of what it means for the body to be safe. Earlier, we saw how warmth could open the body, how water could soften it, and how air, especially air thought to be corrupted, might enter more easily under certain conditions. Now, those ideas begin to settle into a more cautious habit of living, not necessarily codified in strict rules for everyone, but present in advice, in household practice, in the kinds of warnings that pass from one person to another. A body that is kept relatively dry, relatively enclosed, relatively buffered by layers, this begins to feel, in some contexts, like a more stable body. Not perfectly clean in the modern sense, but less exposed to sudden shifts, less vulnerable to the unknown. And this helps explain something that might otherwise seem counterintuitive. Why, in certain parts of Europe moving into the 16th century, full-body bathing appears to decline even further among many populations, particularly in northern regions. It is not that people forget how to bathe. It is that bathing becomes something that requires more justification, more control, more reassurance. In some cases, medical advice leans toward caution. Physicians and writers suggest that frequent bathing, especially in warm water, may weaken the body if done improperly. They warn that pores, once opened, may admit harmful influences. They advise moderation, timing, and restraint. These are not universal prohibitions, but they contribute to an atmosphere in which bathing is no longer automatically seen as beneficial. And in that atmosphere, habits begin to adjust again. Instead of immersing the body, people lean even more heavily on practices that do not disrupt its surface as dramatically. They brush the skin, they wipe it, they change the layers that sit against it. They manage odor and appearance through methods that feel less invasive, less risky, more controlled. There is also an increasing emphasis on what might be called dry cleanliness. The idea that the body can be maintained in a state of acceptable order without frequent contact with large amounts of water. This does not mean the body is left unattended. It means that attention is expressed differently. Hair is combed and covered. Hands are washed carefully, especially in social or communal contexts. Faces are cleaned, often with small amounts of water, cloths, or even simple rinsing. The visible self remains important, perhaps even more so, because it becomes the primary indicator of care. And within this system, the act of bathing begins to drift slightly out of the center of daily life. At the same time, another force is quietly reshaping the landscape, the slow but steady transformation of urban environments. As towns grow, as trade expands, as populations shift, the density and complexity of living conditions increase. Waste management becomes more difficult. Water sources become more strained. Streets become busier, more crowded, more layered with the byproducts of human and animal life. In such environments, the question of cleanliness becomes even more immediate, but also more complicated. The very places where water is available are also the places where it may be compromised. The same rivers that provide access can carry refuse. The same wells that supply households can be affected by proximity to waste. This creates a kind of paradox. The need for cleanliness becomes more visible, more urgent in some ways, but the means of achieving it through full immersion become less reliable. So again, people adapt. They focus on what can be controlled: small quantities of water, targeted washing, careful management of clothing and space. There is also a growing awareness, however imperfect, that certain illnesses seem to follow patterns of contact and environment. Even without a modern understanding of pathogens, people begin to notice that some conditions spread in ways that are not entirely explained by smell alone. This does not lead immediately to accurate theories, but it does reinforce caution around shared spaces, shared water, and shared bodily exposure. Bathing, particularly in communal settings, sits directly within that concern. And yet, even as these cautious habits take hold, the memory of bathing as comfort, as relief, as even pleasure, does not disappear. It lingers in certain practices, in certain regions, in certain classes. There are still baths prepared in private chambers. There are still therapeutic uses of water. There are still moments when immersion feels not only desirable, but necessary. This creates a kind of tension that runs quietly through the period. On one side, the body as something to be protected, enclosed, and managed carefully. On the other, the body as something that still responds to warmth, to water, to the simple human desire for physical ease. And it is within that tension that we begin to see small, almost experimental shifts. People try different balances. Some bathe more frequently under controlled conditions. Others avoid it except when required. Some rely heavily on linen and surface care. Others incorporate occasional immersion as part of a broader routine. There is no single pattern. There is no uniform rule. Instead, there is a landscape of practices, each shaped by local conditions, personal beliefs, available resources, and the slow accumulation of shared experience. What remains consistent, however, is the underlying logic: that the body is not separate from its environment, that cleanliness is not a simple act, and that every decision about how to care for the body carries with it a set of assumptions about safety, comfort, and risk. And as the early modern world begins to take clearer form, bringing with it new trade routes, new materials, new ideas, and new ways of thinking about the body, those assumptions will not simply disappear. They will be challenged, reshaped, and, in some cases, quietly reversed as people begin to encounter different models of cleanliness that suggest the relationship between water, the body, and health might be more flexible than they had long believed. Exposure, not in the sense of physical vulnerability, but in the sense of cultural contact. As trade routes expand and connections between regions deepen, Europeans do not remain isolated within a single set of habits or assumptions. They observe, sometimes with curiosity and sometimes with suspicion, the practices of others, particularly in parts of the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and beyond, where bathing traditions had followed different paths. In some of these societies, bathing remained more regular, more structured, and more embedded in daily or weekly life. Public bathhouses continued to operate with a rhythm that, to a Northern European observer, might feel both familiar and strangely persistent. Water, heat, steam, these were not occasional luxuries, but integrated elements of routine. And when these practices were encountered, they did not simply pass unnoticed. Travelers wrote about them, merchants observed them, diplomats experienced them firsthand, and often their accounts carried a tone that is difficult to reduce to a single reaction. There is admiration, at times, for the comfort and refinement of such systems. There is also unease, an awareness that these practices do not align neatly with the caution that had taken root elsewhere. This moment of comparison introduces a subtle tension into European thinking. If other societies can bathe regularly without obvious harm, then what does that suggest about long-held assumptions? But at the same time, If those societies are perceived as different, climatically, culturally, even morally, then perhaps their practices are not directly transferable, so the observation does not immediately overturn existing habits. Instead, it lingers. It creates a kind of background question that does not yet have a clear answer. Meanwhile, within Europe itself, incremental changes continue to reshape daily life. One of the most important of these is the gradual improvement in the availability and variety of materials. Textiles, in particular, become more accessible over time, especially in urban centers. Linen production expands. Trade brings new fabrics. Households that once had only a few garments begin, in some cases, to accumulate more. This does not transform life overnight, but it does allow for a more consistent rotation of clothing, especially the inner layers closest to the body. And as this rotation becomes more feasible, the system of cleanliness that relies on fabric rather than immersion becomes more stable, more sustainable. A person who can change into a relatively clean shirt more often can maintain a sense of freshness without needing to bathe as frequently. The body remains buffered, managed, and socially presentable. And because this method aligns with existing concerns about exposure, about opening the body, about the risks of water and air, it fits comfortably within the established logic. At the same time, domestic practices continue to evolve in small, almost imperceptible ways. Basins, pitchers, and cloths become standard features of daily life across many households. Washing, in this form, becomes a repeated, localized act. It happens at the beginning of the day, before meals, after work, before rest. It is not dramatic. It does not require preparation on a large scale. But it is constant. This constancy matters. It creates a rhythm of care that does not depend on rare, intensive actions. Instead, it distributes cleanliness across time, making it something that is maintained rather than achieved in a single moment. And in doing so, it reinforces a particular understanding of the body, not as something that must be periodically reset through immersion, but as something that can be kept in balance through continuous attention. There is also a growing refinement in how spaces are managed. Even in modest homes, there is increasing attention to order, where items are placed, how bedding is arranged, how air circulates through a room. These are not modern sanitary systems, but they reflect a desire to create environments that feel controlled, predictable, and stable. Airing out bedding, for example, becomes a regular practice, not because of a precise scientific understanding, but because of a recognition that stale, enclosed conditions are undesirable. Opening a window when possible or shifting textiles into fresh air becomes part of maintaining the household. Again, this is a form of cleanliness that does not rely on bathing, but still contributes to the overall management of the body and its surroundings. And yet, despite all of this adaptation, there are still moments when the limitations of the system become more visible. Summer, for instance, brings its own challenges. Heat intensifies odor. Labor becomes more physically taxing. The body produces more sweat more quickly. In these conditions, the desire for water, cooling, cleansing, immediate, becomes harder to ignore. And in some regions, particularly where climate allows, we do see more frequent contact with water in these seasons. Rivers, lakes, and coastal areas offer opportunities for washing that are less constrained by the need for heated water. But even here, caution does not disappear. Concerns about water quality, about currents, about safety, remain present. So even in moments of relative ease, the relationship with bathing remains measured. Another revealing context is that of children. Young bodies, often less bound by the same layers of clothing and labor, might interact with water more freely. But their care is also shaped by adult understanding. Decisions about when and how to wash them reflect the same balancing act: comfort against caution, cleanliness against exposure. And as these children grow, they inherit not just habits, but the reasoning behind them. They learn, often without explicit instruction, what feels appropriate, what feels risky, what feels necessary. In this way, the patterns of medieval bathing are not imposed from above. They are absorbed, repeated, and adjusted across generations. What becomes increasingly clear is that the absence of frequent bathing, as we might define it, is not a gap in the system. It is a feature of a system that has been carefully, if imperfectly, constructed to fit the realities of the time. A system that prioritizes stability over intensity. A system that values control over exposure. A system that seeks to maintain the body not through occasional dramatic acts, but through steady, manageable routines. And yet, as the early modern period continues to unfold, new influences, some subtle, some more disruptive, begin to press against this system from multiple directions at once. Not enough to break it immediately, but enough to introduce small fractures, small questions, small possibilities that will, over time, begin to change how people think about something as seemingly simple and yet deeply complex as washing the human body. One of those pressures comes from the slow reorganization of knowledge itself. Medical writing, which had long relied on inherited traditions and careful observation, begins to expand in both volume and circulation. More texts are copied, translated, and eventually printed. Advice that might once have been localized, passed within a region or a household, starts to move more widely, encountering other ideas, other interpretations, other conclusions. And within that expanding conversation, the body becomes a subject of renewed attention. Not in a sudden, revolutionary way, but through a gradual accumulation of questions. How does illness move from one person to another? Why do certain environments seem to encourage sickness while others do not? What role does air truly play? What role does contact play? And where, within all of this, does water fit? The answers remain incomplete, often contradictory. But the act of asking them begins to loosen the certainty that had shaped earlier habits. At the same time, the physical world itself is becoming more connected. Goods move further. People travel more frequently across regions. Ideas, practices, and expectations no longer remain confined within narrow boundaries. A merchant who has seen bathing traditions elsewhere does not simply forget them upon returning home. A physician who reads accounts from distant places does not entirely ignore them. These impressions accumulate quietly, without immediately overturning existing behavior. But they begin to sit alongside it, offering alternatives that may, under the right conditions, feel worth reconsidering. There is also a growing emphasis on refinement in certain social circles, particularly among the elite. Courtly life, already attentive to appearance and behavior, becomes increasingly focused on subtle distinctions: how one dresses, how one moves, how one presents oneself in both public and private settings. In this context, the management of the body becomes even more deliberate. Skin, hair, scent, and clothing are all part of a carefully constructed image. And while full immersion in water is still not a daily routine, there is a gradual increase in attention to the details that create the impression of cleanliness. The face is washed more carefully. Hands are attended to more consistently. Hair is styled, covered, or treated with oils and preparations. This does not represent a return to frequent bathing in the modern sense, but it does signal a shift in emphasis from simply maintaining acceptable order to cultivating a more refined version of that order. And within that refinement, the absence of bathing becomes slightly more noticeable, not as a moral failing, but as a limitation that people begin, in small ways, to work around. There are also changes in the way interiors are constructed and experienced. Wealthier homes, in particular, begin to incorporate more features that allow for controlled environments. Fireplaces that provide more consistent heat, rooms that can be closed off, spaces that offer a degree of privacy not previously available. These changes do not eliminate the challenges of bathing, but they begin to reduce some of the barriers. A room that can be kept warm for longer makes the act of washing less risky. A space that can be closed offers more comfort and discretion. The bath, in these contexts, becomes slightly easier to manage. And as it becomes easier, even in limited settings, it becomes more thinkable. Not yet routine, not yet widespread, but possible in a way that aligns with the growing desire for control and refinement. At the same time, we see a continued reliance on older methods, which do not disappear but instead adapt alongside these changes. Linen remains central. The layering of clothing continues to mediate the relationship between body and environment. Partial washing, wiping, and grooming remain the foundation of daily care. This coexistence of old and new practices is important. It shows that the shift is not abrupt. People do not abandon one system and adopt another overnight. They incorporate new possibilities into existing frameworks, adjusting gradually, sometimes unevenly. And beneath these adjustments, the question of risk never fully disappears. Even as some individuals experiment with more frequent or more controlled bathing, the older concerns remain present. The idea that the body can be opened, that it can be influenced by air and water, that exposure carries consequences, these ideas do not vanish. They persist, shaping decisions, moderating behavior. So the emerging pattern is not one of simple change, but of layered caution. A person might bathe more often than their grandparents did, but still choose their moment carefully. They might warm a room, prepare the body, and ensure that the transition afterward is managed. They might combine immersion with the continued use of linen and partial washing, rather than replacing one with the other. In this way, the evolution of bathing practices becomes less about frequency and more about integration. It is not just a question of doing more or less, but of how different methods are combined, balanced, and adapted to new conditions. And as this integration continues, another subtle shift begins to take place. One that is less visible in daily routines, but increasingly important in the long term. The idea that cleanliness might be something that can be improved systematically, not just maintained within the limits of environment and belief, but actively enhanced through better materials, better spaces, better understanding. This idea is still in its early stages. It does not yet have the clarity or the confidence that will come later, but it is present in fragments, in suggestions, in experiments. A slightly cleaner room, a slightly better managed water source, a slightly more consistent habit of washing certain parts of the body. Each of these is small on its own, but together, they begin to suggest that the boundaries of what is possible are not entirely fixed. And it is this suggestion, quiet, tentative, but persistent, that will continue to shape how people approach the body, the environment, and the simple, complicated act of washing, as the world around them becomes ever more connected, ever more crowded, and ever more open to the possibility that long-held assumptions might slowly begin to change. What begins to emerge from that possibility is not an immediate transformation, but a growing awareness that cleanliness can be influenced by design as much as by habit. In earlier centuries, most washing practices had been shaped by necessity, what could be done within the limits of space, water, fuel, and belief. Now, gradually, people begin to experiment with the idea that those limits themselves might be adjusted, that a room could be arranged differently, that water could be stored, moved, or heated with slightly more efficiency, that the act of washing might be supported, rather than resisted, by the structure of the home. These changes are subtle, and at first they belong almost entirely to the wealthier segments of society. A household with more resources can afford additional vessels, more consistent fuel, better textiles, and servants to manage the labor involved. Within such households, the bath becomes less of a rare disruption and more of an occasional, manageable routine. Still not frequent in the modern sense, but less exceptional than before. And as this happens, something interesting begins to take shape in the background. The idea that comfort itself can be engineered. A warmer room, a more reliable fire, a surface that retains heat a little longer, a space that allows the body to be washed without immediate exposure to cold air. Each of these adjustments reduces one of the small risks that had once discouraged bathing. And while none of them solves the problem entirely, together they begin to shift the balance. What was once difficult becomes slightly easier. What was once uncertain becomes slightly more predictable. And in that small shift, habits begin to loosen. At the same time, the circulation of goods introduces new materials that interact differently with both the body and water. Fabrics change in texture and availability. Soaps, in some regions, become more refined, more varied, and more accessible to those beyond the very highest ranks. Even small improvements in these materials can alter the experience of washing, making it feel less harsh, less laborious, more effective. This does not immediately lead to a cultural embrace of frequent bathing, but it does begin to remove some of the practical barriers that had once reinforced its rarity. And alongside these material changes, there is a slow, almost philosophical shift in how the body is imagined. Earlier, the body had often been understood primarily as something to be balanced, to be protected from excess heat, excess cold, excess moisture, excess dryness. Now, while that language does not disappear, it begins to share space with a slightly different perspective. The body as something that can be improved through care, shaped through practice, maintained through deliberate attention. This is not yet a modern concept of hygiene, but it moves in that direction. It suggests that cleanliness is not only about avoiding harm, but about achieving a certain condition, a state that can be approached if not fully controlled. And once that idea takes hold, even in a limited way, it begins to influence behavior. A person might begin to think not only about whether it is safe to bathe, but whether it might be beneficial under the right conditions. They might consider how often is appropriate, rather than simply whether to bathe at all. They might pay closer attention to the results, to how the body feels afterward, to whether the experience aligns with comfort or discomfort. These are small changes, but they accumulate. And as they do, they create a kind of quiet diversity in practice. Two households, living in similar regions, might approach bathing quite differently. One maintaining older patterns of caution, the other experimenting with slightly more frequent washing under controlled conditions. Neither is entirely right or wrong within the context of the time. Both are responding to the same set of pressures, but interpreting them in different ways. This diversity is important because it reminds us that historical change is rarely uniform. It does not move in a straight line. It spreads unevenly, influenced by class, geography, climate, and personal inclination. In some places, older habits remain dominant for longer. In others, new possibilities take root more quickly. And in many cases, the two coexist, overlapping and interacting in ways that are not always visible from a distance. Meanwhile, the growing scale of cities continues to shape the conversation in the background. Urban life brings people into closer contact with one another, but it also concentrates the challenges of managing water, waste, and space. The same density that allows for innovation also creates new pressures. Streets become more crowded. Waste becomes more difficult to control. Water sources, already variable, are placed under greater strain. And in these conditions, the question of cleanliness becomes not just personal, but collective. How does a community manage the interaction between bodies, materials, and environment? How do individual habits contribute to or complicate the shared experience of living in close proximity? These questions do not yet have systematic answers, but they begin to surface in small ways, in regulations, in local customs, in the expectations that people hold for one another. And once again, bathing sits at the center of this tension. On one hand, it offers a clear, intuitive form of cleansing. On the other, it requires resources, space, and conditions that are not always available or easily managed within a crowded environment. So the balance continues. People wash, but not always by immersion. They manage their bodies through layers, routines, and small acts of care. They experiment cautiously with new possibilities. They adapt continuously to changing conditions. And through all of this, the meaning of bathing remains unsettled. Not fixed, not fully resolved, but open to interpretation. Because what is beginning to emerge, almost without being fully recognized, is the idea that cleanliness might not be a single act or even a single standard, but a shifting relationship between the body, its surroundings, and the knowledge available at a given moment. And as that knowledge continues to grow through observation, through exchange, through the slow accumulation of experience, it will begin to challenge not just how people wash, but how they understand the very boundary between the body and the world around it. Because once that boundary begins to feel less certain, even in a quiet, intuitive way, people start to ask different kinds of questions. Not only what is safe or unsafe, but what is actually happening beneath the surface of what they can see and feel. Up to this point, much of the reasoning around bathing had been shaped by visible effects: warmth, cold, softness of the skin, the presence or absence of odor, and by patterns that could be observed without instruments or controlled testing. But as the early modern period develops, there is a gradual, almost hesitant movement toward a more investigative approach to the body. Not yet scientific in the modern sense, but more attentive. People begin to notice that not all foul environments lead to illness, and not all clean ones guarantee health. They observe that some individuals fall ill while others do not, even under similar conditions. They encounter contradictions that do not fit neatly within existing explanations. And these contradictions begin to accumulate. They do not immediately overturn established ideas about miasma or bodily openness, but they create a kind of pressure, a sense that the old frameworks, while still useful, may not fully explain what is happening. Within this atmosphere of partial doubt, bathing becomes an interesting point of tension. If water can both cleanse and expose, if heat can both comfort and weaken, then the act of bathing sits directly at the intersection of competing interpretations. It can be seen as beneficial under one set of assumptions and questionable under another. And because those assumptions are no longer entirely stable, behavior begins to vary more noticeably. In some households, especially those influenced by emerging medical opinions or by exposure to different cultural practices, there is a cautious reintroduction of more regular bathing. Still controlled, still mindful, but less restricted than before. In others, older habits persist, reinforced by tradition, by local authority, or simply by the absence of compelling reasons to change. This divergence does not create immediate conflict, but it does create difference. People begin to live slightly different versions of the same world, guided by overlapping but not identical understandings of the body. At the same time, the increasing availability of printed material plays a quiet but important role. Advice manuals, medical texts, household guides, these begin to circulate more widely, offering suggestions that range from practical to speculative. Some advocate for cleanliness in ways that edge closer to regular washing. Others reinforce caution, emphasizing the risks of overexposure. And because these texts are not always consistent with one another, they contribute to the sense that there is no single settled answer. A reader might encounter one recommendation in one context and a different one in another. They might follow the advice that seems most reasonable or most aligned with their own experience. Over time, this creates a landscape of practice that is not only varied, but also somewhat fluid. Meanwhile, the material environment continues to evolve. Improvements in heating, however modest, begin to change how indoor spaces are experienced. A room that can be kept warm for longer periods reduces the immediate discomfort associated with washing. It allows for a slightly more controlled transition between wet and dry, between exposed and protected. Similarly, advances in storage and transport make it possible, in some cases, to manage water more efficiently within the household. Larger vessels, better containers, more organized domestic spaces. All of these contribute to a setting in which bathing, while still effortful, becomes less disruptive. And with each small reduction in difficulty, the act itself becomes a little more accessible. But accessibility alone does not determine behavior, because even as these practical barriers are lowered, the cultural and medical frameworks that shaped earlier caution remain influential. People do not simply abandon their inherited understanding. They adjust it, reinterpret it, sometimes contradict it, but rarely discard it entirely. This is why the shift, when it comes, is so gradual. A person might begin to bathe slightly more often, but still avoid doing so in certain seasons. They might embrace washing with warm water, but remain wary of prolonged immersion. They might value cleanliness more explicitly, but still rely heavily on linen, grooming, and controlled exposure. In this sense, the medieval approach does not disappear. It blends into what comes next. And this blending is perhaps most visible in the way people continue to think about the relationship between inside and outside, the body and its environment. Even as new ideas begin to circulate, the old concern with balance remains. The body must not be shocked. It must not be weakened. It must be maintained in a state that feels stable, resilient, capable of withstanding the uncertainties of the world. Bathing, then, is evaluated not only for its immediate effect, but for how it fits within that larger goal. Does it strengthen or weaken? Does it protect or expose? Does it bring comfort that lasts, or comfort that leads to discomfort later? These questions do not have simple answers, and so they are answered differently by different people. And yet, despite this uncertainty, there is a growing sense, quiet but persistent, that the body might benefit from a more consistent form of care. That cleanliness, in some form, contributes not only to appearance but to well-being. This sense is not yet fully articulated. It does not yet rest on a clear understanding of cause and effect. But it is present in the way people begin to pay closer attention to their own experiences, to what feels beneficial, to what seems to align with health. And as that attention deepens, it begins to shift the weight of decision-making slightly away from inherited caution and slightly toward personal observation. A person who finds that washing more frequently improves their comfort may begin to do so, even if traditional advice suggests restraint. Another who experiences discomfort may continue to avoid it. Over time, these individual choices contribute to broader patterns, shaping the gradual evolution of practice. At the same time, the expanding world continues to introduce new influences. Trade brings not only goods, but ideas about how those goods are used. Contact with different regions introduces alternative approaches to cleanliness, to bathing, to the management of the body. Some of these approaches are adopted, others are adapted, some are resisted, but all of them add to the sense that the existing system is not the only one possible. And it is within this expanding field of possibility that the next phase of change begins to take form. Not as a sudden transformation, but as a slow reorientation in which the act of washing the body, once shaped primarily by caution and constraint, starts to be reconsidered through a new and still developing understanding of what it means, not just to avoid harm, but to actively sustain health in a world that is becoming more complex with every passing generation. One of the most important aspects of that reorientation is how people begin to think about repetition. Earlier, repetition in bodily care had been associated with smaller acts, washing hands, wiping the face, changing linen, while full bathing remained occasional. Now, as conditions slowly shift, the idea of repeating larger acts of washing begins to feel slightly less distant, at least in certain environments. Not daily, not even weekly for most, but no longer confined to rare or symbolic moments. This does not come from a single discovery. It emerges from experience layered over time. A household that finds it can manage warm water more reliably may begin to repeat the process more often. A person who notices that a carefully timed bath brings relief without discomfort may begin to trust it more. A servant who becomes accustomed to preparing water for others may develop a more practical familiarity with the process, making it feel less exceptional. These are small shifts, but they alter perception. And once perception begins to change, behavior can follow. Slowly, unevenly, but with a sense of movement that was less visible before. At the same time, there is a growing sensitivity to the idea of residue, not in a chemical sense but in a sensory one. The feeling of sweat left on the skin, the accumulation of oils, the way clothing over time carries traces of the body. These are not new experiences, but they begin to be noticed more consciously, perhaps because of the increasing attention to refinement and presentation. This awareness does not immediately produce a universal solution, but it does sharpen the question: what is the best way to remove what lingers? And for some, the answer begins to include water more frequently. Still, the older habits do not disappear. Linen continues to do much of the work. The layering of clothing remains essential. The daily rhythm of partial washing continues without interruption. But alongside it, in certain settings, a quiet expansion takes place. Bathing becomes one tool among several, rather than an isolated event. There is also a noticeable shift in how time is structured around these practices. In earlier periods, bathing had to compete with the demands of labor and survival. Now, in some households, especially those with more stable resources, time can be set aside more deliberately. A bath might be planned at the end of a work cycle, or at a moment when the household is already engaged in heating water for other purposes. It might be coordinated with laundering, or with the preparation of a room that can retain warmth. In this way, the act is integrated into existing routines rather than standing apart from them. This integration reduces friction, and as friction decreases, repetition becomes more plausible. Meanwhile, the broader environment continues to exert its influence in ways that are not always obvious. Climate, for instance, still shapes behavior. In warmer regions or during warmer months, the threshold for using water remains lower. In colder conditions, caution persists, but it is now moderated by the gradual improvements in indoor comfort. This creates a kind of seasonal rhythm that becomes more flexible over time. A person might bathe more frequently in summer, less in winter, but not avoid it entirely. They might adjust the temperature, the duration, the method. They might rely more on wiping in colder months, and more on immersion when conditions allow. Again, there is no single pattern but a growing range of possibilities. And within this range, the social meaning of cleanliness continues to evolve. As urban centers become more complex and social interactions more layered, the expectations placed on appearance become slightly more refined. It is no longer enough simply to avoid obvious neglect. There is a growing emphasis on consistency, on maintaining a certain standard over time. This does not require constant bathing, but it does encourage a more attentive approach to bodily care. People begin to notice the difference between someone who manages their appearance carefully and someone who does not. These distinctions, subtle at first, become part of how individuals are perceived within their communities. And because those perceptions carry social consequences, they begin to influence behavior. At the same time, the idea of comfort itself begins to shift in tone. Earlier, comfort had often been defined by the absence of extremes. Neither too cold nor too hot, neither too wet nor too dry. Now, in some contexts, comfort begins to include a slightly more positive dimension. Not just the absence of discomfort, but the presence of a certain ease. Warm water under the right conditions contributes to that ease. The sensation of being clean, not just visibly but physically, begins to carry a kind of quiet appeal. And while this appeal is not yet universal, it becomes increasingly recognized. There are also practical innovations, modest but meaningful, that support this change. Improvements in containers, in methods of heating, in the organization of domestic space, all of these contribute to a setting in which bathing can be managed with slightly greater efficiency. A tub that retains heat a little longer. A fire that can be maintained more steadily. A room that can be closed against drafts. Each of these reduces one of the small obstacles that had once made bathing more difficult. And as these obstacles are reduced, the act itself becomes less burdensome. Still, it remains something that requires intention. And perhaps that is the most important point to hold onto as we move forward. Even as bathing becomes more accessible, more integrated, more varied, it does not become automatic. It does not dissolve into the background of daily life in the way it does in the modern world. It remains a choice, a decision shaped by habit, by belief, by circumstance, and by the evolving understanding of what the body needs and what it can tolerate. And it is within that space of decision, between caution and curiosity, between tradition and change, that the story of medieval bathing continues to unfold, gradually shifting toward a future in which the relationship between water and the human body will be reconsidered once again, under a new set of assumptions that are only just beginning to take shape. What becomes increasingly noticeable in this phase is not a dramatic shift in behavior, but a change in how people justify what they do. Earlier, justification had often come from inherited wisdom, custom, authority, the weight of long-standing belief. Now, while those influences remain, there is a growing tendency to look inward as well, to consider personal experience, personal comfort, and the observed effects of different practices on the body itself. A person might still be told that bathing too frequently could weaken them, but if their own experience suggests otherwise under certain conditions, that advice begins to feel less absolute. It is not rejected outright, but it is weighed. This quiet weighing process marks an important transition. It does not produce immediate consensus. It does not erase older habits, but it introduces a degree of flexibility that had previously been less visible. People begin to navigate between what they have been taught and what they have felt, between caution and observation. And as more individuals engage in this process, even in small ways, the collective pattern begins to shift. At the same time, there is a subtle change in how cleanliness is discussed within households themselves. Conversations that might once have been brief or assumed become slightly more deliberate. Decisions about when to wash, how to wash, and under what conditions are made with a bit more attention. This is not a formalized discourse. It does not resemble modern health advice, but it reflects a growing awareness that these decisions matter, not just for appearance, but for how the body functions and feels over time. And this awareness extends to how people prepare for washing. Earlier, the act of bathing might have been approached as a single event. Water is heated, the body is immersed, the process is completed. Now, in some contexts, there is more attention to the stages surrounding it. The body might be warmed beforehand. The room might be prepared more carefully. The transition afterward might be managed with greater intention. Drying thoroughly, resting, avoiding drafts. These adjustments reflect a more nuanced understanding of the act itself. Bathing is no longer simply something that happens to the body. It is something that must be managed before, during, and after. A sequence, rather than a moment. And within that sequence, people begin to find ways to reduce the risks that had once discouraged the practice. This is particularly evident in households where resources allow for a degree of control over the environment. A warmer room, a more stable fire, a supply of dry cloths. These elements, when combined, create a setting in which the body can move through the stages of washing with less disruption. And as this setting becomes more familiar, the act itself becomes less uncertain. Still, the influence of older beliefs remains present in the background. Even as people experiment with more frequent or more controlled bathing, they often do so within limits that reflect inherited caution. They avoid extremes. They pay attention to timing. They remain aware, even if only vaguely, of the idea that the body can be affected by how it is treated. This creates a kind of hybrid approach, partly traditional, partly adaptive, partly cautious, partly exploratory. And it is within this hybrid space that the next layer of change begins to emerge. Because alongside the practical adjustments, there is a gradual shift in how the body is imagined in relation to cleanliness itself. Earlier, cleanliness had often been understood in terms of removal, removing dirt, removing odor, removing what was visibly or sensorially unpleasant. Now, there is a growing sense that cleanliness might also involve preservation, maintaining a certain condition of the body that supports comfort and stability over time. This is a subtle distinction, but it matters. It shifts the focus from reacting to accumulation to preventing it, from occasional correction to ongoing maintenance. And once that idea begins to take hold, even in a limited way, it encourages a different rhythm of care. Instead of waiting until the body feels distinctly in need of washing, a person might act earlier, maintaining a level of cleanliness that prevents discomfort from building. This does not require constant bathing, but it does create a more continuous relationship with the body. At the same time, there is an increasing awareness of how the environment contributes to this process. Air, light, space all begin to be considered, even if informally, as part of maintaining bodily well-being. A room that feels fresh, a space that allows for movement, an environment that does not trap heat or moisture excessively, these qualities begin to matter more. And as they do, the act of washing becomes part of a broader system of care that includes not just the body, but its surroundings. This system is still incomplete. It lacks the precision, the tools, and the understanding that will come later. But it represents a shift toward thinking of cleanliness as something that can be supported structurally, not just achieved individually. And within that shift, the role of water begins to expand again. Not dramatically, not universally, but enough to be noticed. Water is no longer seen only as a potential risk or a controlled tool. It begins, in certain contexts, to be reconsidered as something that can contribute positively to the ongoing maintenance of the body, if used carefully, if integrated properly, if balanced with other practices. This reconsideration does not erase the past. It builds on it. It carries forward the caution, the awareness of risk, the attention to timing and environment. But it places those elements within a slightly more open framework, one that allows for adaptation rather than strict limitation. And as this framework continues to develop, influenced by changing materials, shifting environments, and an expanding range of ideas, the act of bathing moves further away from its earlier position at the margins of daily life and begins, slowly and unevenly, to edge back toward the center of how people understand the care of the human body. But that movement toward the center does not happen cleanly or without hesitation. In fact, what defines this phase most clearly is not confidence, but negotiation. Because even as bathing becomes more thinkable, more manageable, and in some cases more desirable, it continues to carry with it a memory, a lingering sense of uncertainty rooted in generations of caution. The body, after all, is still understood as something that can be affected in ways that are not entirely visible or predictable. And so each step toward greater use of water is accompanied by a corresponding effort to control the conditions under which that water is used. This is where the act of bathing becomes increasingly deliberate. A person does not simply decide to bathe more often. They adjust the environment around the act. They close doors more carefully. They ensure the fire is steady. They gather dry cloths in advance. They pay attention to the sequence, entering the water, remaining in it for a measured time, and then exiting in a way that avoids sudden exposure. In other words, bathing becomes something closer to a managed process than a casual habit. And this management, in turn, reflects a deeper shift in how people relate to their surroundings. There is a growing sense that the environment is not fixed, but can be shaped, adjusted, and, to some extent, controlled. That the risks associated with certain practices are not absolute, but conditional, dependent on how those practices are carried out. This idea, subtle as it is, begins to change the tone of decision-making. Instead of asking whether bathing is inherently good or bad, people begin to ask under what conditions it becomes one or the other. And that question opens the door to experimentation, not in a dramatic or systematic way, but in small, repeated acts. A slightly warmer room, a shorter immersion, a different time of day. Each variation offers a chance to observe how the body responds, how the experience feels, whether it aligns with comfort or discomfort. Over time, these observations accumulate. They do not produce a universal rule, but they create a kind of practical knowledge, an understanding that is personal, local, and adaptable. And as more people engage in this process, even unconsciously, the overall pattern of bathing begins to shift again, not toward uniformity but toward diversity. Some individuals become more confident in using water as part of regular care. Others remain cautious, preferring to rely on established routines. Most occupy a space somewhere in between, adjusting their behavior according to circumstance. At the same time, the broader cultural landscape continues to evolve. Ideas about refinement, self-presentation, and bodily awareness become more prominent, especially in urban and courtly environments. The body is not only something to be maintained, but something to be presented to others, to society, to oneself. And within that presentation, cleanliness takes on a slightly more visible role. Not necessarily through frequent bathing alone, but through a combination of practices that together create the impression of order, care, and composure. The face is attended to, the hands are kept clean, the hair is managed, the clothing is arranged and, when possible, refreshed. These visible elements become markers of a person's place within a social world that is itself becoming more structured and more attentive to detail. And because these markers can be maintained without full immersion, they continue to coexist with a bathing practice that is still, in many cases, intermittent. Yet, the presence of water in that system grows. It appears more often in small forms, in basins, in cloths, in controlled uses that do not require full immersion. And in some contexts, it appears more often in larger forms as well, as bathing becomes easier to integrate into the rhythms of certain households. There is also a gradual change in how the body responds to these practices. A person who bathes more regularly, even if only occasionally by modern standards, may begin to experience the benefits differently. The body feels refreshed. The skin feels clearer. The sensation of warmth followed by careful drying becomes something that can be anticipated rather than avoided. These experiences, repeated over time, begin to build a quiet trust. Not a complete abandonment of caution, but a softening of it. A recognition that, under the right conditions, bathing does not necessarily lead to harm. And as that recognition spreads, even slowly, it begins to influence how people think about the balance between risk and reward. At the same time, the physical infrastructure of daily life continues to shift in ways that support these changes. Water storage becomes slightly more organized. Heating methods, while still limited, become somewhat more reliable. Domestic spaces, even modest ones, are arranged with a bit more attention to comfort and function. Each of these developments is small, but together they create a context in which bathing no longer stands apart from daily life as an exceptional act. It becomes, in certain settings, one option among many, a tool that can be used when appropriate, alongside the other methods that have long defined cleanliness. And perhaps most importantly, the meaning of that tool continues to evolve. Bathing is no longer only about removing visible dirt, nor only about managing risk. It begins, in a quiet and still incomplete way, to be associated with a broader idea of care, of maintaining the body in a state that supports both comfort and function over time. This idea is not yet fully formed. It does not yet have the clarity or the authority that it will later acquire. But it is present in fragments, in habits, in the gradual adjustment of expectations. And as it continues to develop, it begins to draw the act of bathing further into the ongoing conversation about what it means to live well within the constraints of a changing world. A conversation that is itself becoming more complex, more layered, and more open to the possibility that the relationship between the body and water is not fixed, but something that can be understood, reshaped, and gradually redefined. What begins to emerge from that redefinition is a subtle but important shift in confidence, not a bold certainty, but a growing willingness to engage with the body in ways that had once felt less predictable. And that willingness shows itself most clearly in how people begin to tolerate variation. Earlier, the fear surrounding bathing had often been tied to sudden change. The movement from warmth to cold, from enclosure to exposure, from dryness to moisture. These transitions were seen as moments of vulnerability. Now, as people learn to manage those transitions more carefully, they begin to accept a wider range of bodily experiences. A bath is no longer a sharp departure from the body's normal state, but something that can be introduced gradually, controlled, and resolved without disruption. This does not remove risk entirely, but it reframes it. Instead of being something to avoid, risk becomes something to be navigated. And once that navigation becomes familiar, the act itself becomes less intimidating. At the same time, there is a growing recognition, again quiet and incremental, that the body responds not just to isolated actions but to patterns. That what is done consistently, even in small ways, can shape how the body feels over longer periods. This idea begins to influence how people think about cleanliness as a whole. Rather than relying solely on occasional larger acts of washing, there is a gradual move toward combining those acts with a steady rhythm of smaller care. Bathing, when it occurs, is supported by daily practices that maintain the body in a more stable condition. And this combination begins to feel more effective than either approach alone. There is also a shift in how people think about recovery. Earlier, the concern had often been what might happen immediately after bathing, whether the body would be exposed, whether it would become chilled, whether it would be weakened. Now, as practices become more controlled, attention begins to extend beyond that immediate moment. How does the body feel hours later? The next day? Does the act of washing contribute to a sense of sustained comfort, or does it introduce new discomfort? These questions, simple as they are, encourage a longer view. And in that longer view, bathing begins to be evaluated not just for its immediate effect, but for how it fits into the ongoing experience of living in the body. At the same time, social observation continues to play a role. People notice how others manage themselves. They observe differences in appearance, in scent, in the way clothing sits against the body. These observations are rarely formalized, but they influence perception. A person who appears consistently composed, whose clothing is fresh, whose presence is ordered, begins to represent a kind of standard. And while that standard is not defined solely by bathing, the practices that contribute to it, including controlled washing, become part of how it is achieved. This creates a gentle pressure, not a demand, but an invitation to align with a certain level of care. And as more individuals respond to that invitation, even in small ways, the overall pattern continues to shift. Meanwhile, the physical experience of bathing itself becomes more familiar in certain contexts. The sensation of warm water, once associated with caution, begins to be associated more often with relief. The process of drying, when managed properly, becomes less stressful. The entire sequence, preparation, immersion, recovery, begins to feel more predictable. And predictability, perhaps more than anything else, changes how a practice is perceived. What is predictable can be planned. What can be planned can be repeated. And what can be repeated begins slowly to take on the character of habit. Still, this habit remains uneven. It belongs more clearly to some households than others. It is shaped by access to resources, by climate, by personal inclination. For many, especially those whose lives remain dominated by labor and limited means, the older patterns continue to hold. But even there, the influence of broader change is not entirely absent. A person may not bathe frequently, but they may become more attentive to how they wash their hands, their face, their clothing. They may adopt small adjustments that reflect the wider shift in thinking, even if the larger act of bathing remains occasional. In this way, change moves across society not as a single wave, but as a series of small currents, each touching different parts of life in different ways. And beneath all of this, there remains a persistent question, one that is not yet fully answered, but that continues to guide the evolution of practice. What does it mean for the body to be truly clean? Is it a matter of appearance, of scent, of sensation? Is it the absence of visible dirt, or the presence of a certain feeling? Is it achieved through water, through cloth, through air, or through some combination of all three? These questions do not yet have clear answers, but they are being asked more often, more consciously. And as they are asked, they begin to reshape the way people think about the tools at their disposal. Water is no longer just a resource to be used sparingly, nor just a potential risk to be managed. It becomes part of a broader set of possibilities, one element among many in the ongoing effort to understand and care for the body. And as that effort continues, influenced by changing knowledge, evolving environments, and the steady accumulation of lived experience, the practice of bathing moves further along its quiet transformation. No longer confined to the margins of medieval life, but not yet fully integrated into the everyday rhythms that will define the world to come. And as that effort continues, influenced by changing knowledge, evolving environments, and the steady accumulation of lived experience, the practice of bathing moves further along its quiet transformation, no longer confined to the margins of medieval life, but not yet fully integrated into the everyday rhythms that will define the world to come. It is at this in-between stage that something particularly revealing happens. People begin to separate, even if only unconsciously, the idea of being clean from the single act of having bathed. For centuries, those two ideas had been loosely connected but not identical. Now, the gap between them becomes more visible. A person may be considered clean without having recently immersed their entire body in water, and conversely, a person who has bathed may not necessarily maintain that state for long if the surrounding conditions quickly undo the effect. This realization, subtle as it is, reshapes priorities. Instead of focusing on isolated acts, attention begins to shift toward continuity, how long a state of cleanliness can be preserved, and what practices help extend it. Linen, again, becomes central here, but now with a slightly different emphasis. It is not only absorbing and protecting, it is preserving. It extends the effect of washing by maintaining a barrier between the body and its environment. And as preservation becomes more important, the timing of bathing itself begins to change. Rather than occurring only when the body feels distinctly in need, bathing starts, in some contexts, to be used more strategically. Before important social interactions, after periods of sustained labor, at moments when the body can be carefully managed afterward. It becomes less reactive and slightly more anticipatory. This anticipatory quality marks another small but meaningful shift. It suggests that cleanliness is not only about responding to the past, what has already accumulated, but about preparing for the future, what is about to be encountered. The body is readied, arranged, and maintained with an eye toward what lies ahead. At the same time, the relationship between bathing and rest begins to take on a more defined shape. In earlier patterns, the concern had often been that bathing could weaken the body if not handled properly. Now, as practices become more controlled, bathing and rest begin to align more closely. A bath is followed by a period of stillness, of warmth, of recovery. The two become part of the same sequence. This pairing changes the experience. Bathing is no longer a disruption to the body's stability, but a transition into a different kind of state, one that can be managed, extended, and even, in some cases, valued for its own sake. And within that transition, the sensory dimension of cleanliness becomes more pronounced. The feeling of warmth lingering in the skin, the absence of residue, the way fabric sits differently against the body afterward. These are not abstract ideas. They are immediate, tangible experiences. And as they become more familiar, they begin to carry their own weight in decision-making. A person may not articulate why they choose to bathe at a particular moment, but the memory of these sensations plays a role. In this way, experience begins to complement tradition, not replacing it, but adding another layer to how choices are made. Meanwhile, the broader social environment continues to reinforce certain expectations. As interactions become more frequent and more structured, especially in towns and courts, the ability to maintain a consistent appearance gains importance. And while bathing is only one part of that, it begins to contribute more noticeably in contexts where it can be managed. A freshly washed face, a cleaner neckline, a more settled arrangement of hair. These details, small as they are, accumulate into a visible difference. And because these differences are observed, even if not explicitly discussed, they begin to influence behavior. People adjust not because they are told to, but because they notice. At the same time, there is a growing awareness that cleanliness is not entirely individual. In more densely populated environments, the condition of one person can affect the experience of others. Odor, proximity, shared space. These factors create a subtle network of influence. And within that network, the management of the body becomes part of a broader social balance. This does not yet produce formal systems of public hygiene, but it does create an environment in which personal practices are quietly connected to collective experience. And within that connection, the role of water continues to expand, carefully, conditionally, but steadily. There is also an emerging appreciation for moderation in a slightly different sense. Earlier, moderation had often meant limiting exposure, avoiding extremes, restraining practices that might disturb the body. Now, moderation begins to include balance between methods, not relying entirely on bathing but not excluding it either, integrating it into a broader system of care. This balanced approach allows for flexibility. A person may rely on linen and partial washing for daily maintenance, and incorporate bathing at intervals that suit their circumstances. They may adjust their habits according to season, health, or social need. They may respond to the body's signals with a greater degree of attention. And in doing so, they participate in a pattern that is becoming more dynamic, more responsive, more open to variation. At the same time, the physical act of bathing itself continues to evolve in small ways. The arrangement of the tub, the temperature of the water, the sequence of washing, the methods of drying. Each of these elements is subject to gradual refinement, shaped by experience and shared knowledge. No single innovation transforms the practice, but the accumulation of many small adjustments makes it more accessible, more comfortable, more reliable. And reliability, once again, is key, because what can be relied upon can be repeated. And what can be repeated begins to form part of the structure of daily life, even if only intermittently. Still, it is important to recognize that this structure remains incomplete. For many, the conditions required for regular bathing are still difficult to achieve. Water must still be carried. Fuel must still be gathered. Time must still be found. The environment must still be managed. So the transformation remains uneven, shaped by the same factors that have always influenced it: class, geography, climate, and the distribution of resources. But despite that unevenness, the direction of change becomes clearer. Bathing is no longer held at a distance by uncertainty alone. It is being drawn gradually into a more central role within a system that is itself becoming more attentive, more deliberate, and more open to the idea that the body can be cared for in ways that extend beyond the limits that once defined it. And as this gradual shift continues through observation, through adaptation, through the steady layering of new experiences onto old beliefs, the act of washing the body moves closer to becoming not just a response to circumstance, but a considered part of how people begin to shape their daily lives in a world that is, slowly but unmistakably, changing around them. What becomes clearer in this stage is that bathing is no longer simply something people do. It is something they begin to plan. And that distinction, quiet as it is, marks a deeper transformation. Planning requires anticipation. It requires a sense that the act will be worth the effort, that the conditions can be arranged, that the outcome will justify the time and resources involved. And once an act is planned, even occasionally, it begins to occupy a different place in the structure of daily life. A household might begin to set aside certain days or certain moments when water is already being heated for other purposes. Washing and laundering might be brought closer together, not as identical tasks, but as related ones, part of the same cycle of renewal. The rhythms of care begin to align. This alignment does not create regular bathing in the modern sense, but it introduces a form of rhythm where previously there had been more fragmentation. And rhythm, once established, tends to stabilize practice. At the same time, there is a growing attentiveness to the aftereffects of bathing, not just in terms of immediate comfort, but in how it influences the body's readiness for what comes next. A person who bathes before rest may notice a deeper ease in the body. A person who bathes before a social interaction may notice a greater sense of composure. These observations are not recorded systematically, but they are felt, remembered, and quietly repeated. And over time, they begin to guide behavior. This is also the point at which we begin to see a more distinct layering of practices, where bathing does not replace earlier methods, but enhances them. A person might wash their hands and face daily, change linen regularly when possible, and then, at intervals, incorporate a more complete washing of the body. Each layer supports the others, creating a more continuous sense of cleanliness without relying on any single act. This layered system is both practical and adaptive. It allows individuals to maintain a degree of care even when resources are limited, while also taking advantage of opportunities when conditions improve. It reflects a kind of quiet efficiency, using what is available when it is available in a way that aligns with both necessity and comfort. And within this system, the meaning of bathing continues to evolve. It is no longer defined primarily by its rarity, nor by the caution that once surrounded it. Instead, it begins to be understood as one part of a broader effort to maintain the body in a state that supports daily life. Not perfect cleanliness, not constant purity, but a manageable, sustainable condition. There is also a subtle shift in how people interpret the body's signals. Earlier, discomfort might have been accepted as an inevitable part of life, something to be endured rather than addressed directly. Now, in some contexts, there is a slightly greater willingness to respond to that discomfort, to adjust practices in ways that reduce it. If the body feels heavy or unclean, a person may be more inclined to consider washing as a response, rather than simply waiting for the condition to pass. This does not mean that bathing becomes frequent, but it does mean that it becomes more closely tied to the body's immediate experience. And that connection between sensation and action strengthens the role of bathing within the overall system of care. Meanwhile, the broader intellectual environment continues to shift in ways that subtly support these changes. Even without a full understanding of the mechanisms involved, there is a growing curiosity about the relationship between environment, behavior, and health. Observations are made, comparisons are drawn, patterns are noted, and within that process, the role of water, its capacity to cleanse, to refresh, to alter the condition of the body, remains present as a point of interest. Not fully understood, not consistently applied, but increasingly considered. At the same time, the material world continues to offer small but meaningful improvements. Containers become more varied in size and shape. Heating methods, while still labor-intensive, become slightly more efficient. Spaces are arranged with a bit more attention to function. Each of these changes reduces the effort required to perform acts of washing, even if only marginally. And marginal improvements, repeated across many aspects of daily life, begin to accumulate into something more noticeable. They create a context in which bathing is not effortless, but less burdensome than before. And as the burden decreases, the threshold for action lowers. This is particularly evident in households where labor can be distributed. Servants, family members, or shared responsibilities allow tasks to be divided, making it easier to prepare water, manage space, and coordinate the process. In such settings, bathing becomes more integrated into the flow of domestic life, even if it remains occasional. But even beyond these more privileged environments, the influence of these changes begins to spread. Ideas travel, practices are observed, adjustments are made, however small. A person who cannot prepare a full bath may still adopt a more thorough method of washing with a basin and cloth. They may pay closer attention to drying, to layering, to maintaining the body's condition between larger acts of cleaning. In this way, the broader transformation touches many lives, even if it does not affect them all equally. And through all of this, the central tension remains, but it begins to soften. The body is still understood as something that must be protected. The environment is still recognized as unpredictable. But the relationship between the two becomes slightly more navigable. Bathing, once seen as a potentially disruptive act, becomes something that can be managed within that relationship. Carefully, thoughtfully, with attention to timing, to sequence, to context. And as people continue to engage with that process, testing, adjusting, observing, the act of washing the body moves further along its gradual path, becoming less defined by fear of what might happen, and more by an emerging sense of what can be done, under the right conditions, to maintain a body that feels, if not perfectly clean, then at least steadily cared for within the shifting realities of a world that has not yet settled into the patterns that will eventually define it. And a body that feels, if not perfectly clean, then at least steadily cared for within the shifting realities of a world that has not yet settled into the patterns that will eventually define it. Because in the end, what this long, quiet evolution reveals is not a simple story about people who did or did not bathe. It reveals a world that was constantly negotiating with itself. A world where the human body was never taken for granted, never assumed to be stable, sealed, or fully understood, but instead treated as something that had to be managed carefully, thoughtfully, and often with limited certainty. A world where warmth could comfort, but also expose, where water could cleanse, but also unsettle, where cleanliness was never just a matter of habit, but a balance between knowledge, belief, and circumstance. And within that balance, medieval people were not careless. They were attentive. They noticed the effects of their environment. They adapted to the limits of their resources. They developed systems, layered, imperfect, but deeply practical, that allowed them to maintain their bodies in ways that made sense for the conditions they lived in. What appears, from a modern perspective, as absence was often adaptation. What seems like neglect was often caution. And what we interpret as a lack of cleanliness was, more often than not, a different definition of it, one shaped not by constant immersion in water, but by a continuous effort to remain stable within a world that offered very few guarantees. And as that world slowly changed through new materials, new spaces, new ideas, the meaning of bathing began to change with it. Not all at once, not in a straight line, but gradually, unevenly, and often quietly, as generations adjusted what they inherited, testing new possibilities against old instincts, and reshaping their understanding of the body step by careful step, until, eventually, the act of bathing would move closer to the center of daily life, not because the past had been wrong, but because the conditions that shaped it had shifted. And perhaps the most interesting part of that journey is this, that even today, long after water became easy, private, and abundant, we still carry traces of that older logic. We still warm the room. We still avoid stepping out into cold air too quickly. We still associate bathing with rest, with comfort, with a kind of reset that goes beyond the surface. In small ways, we still treat the body as something that responds to its environment, something that needs to be managed through transitions, not just actions. And in that sense, the medieval world is not as distant as it first appears. It lingers quietly in the habits we barely think about. If there's one detail that stays with you, it might be this: what part of medieval life felt the most unfamiliar, or the most unexpectedly familiar? And if you'd like more calm, thoughtful journeys into the everyday realities of the past, you can always stay with the channel for what comes next.